Ekyo or all right. How about that? Got it. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Everyone's doing very well. Most of you probably, well, maybe not all of you, but most of you know I've been quite sick lately. But I have to say, feel some degree of normality coming back in my life. So that feels really quite wonderful, actually. Okay, then what I'm going to do is in this, we're having at Hokyoji, we're in the middle of a 3-week uh, practice period with a session starting Monday evening. And we've been using as the theme a short sutta from the Nikayas called The Burden. And it takes, for the few of you who haven't been in a practice period, the short sutta takes 13 minutes to read, and I'll read it now. This is what I heard. The fortunate one was once staying in Suvathi, in Jeta Groves in Anathapindika's park. There he spoke to a group of mendicants. I will teach you about the burden. I will teach you about the bearer of the burden, the taking up of the burden, and the putting down of the burden. Listen to what I say. What then is the burden? To this it should be said the 5 existential functions subject to grasping. Which 5? Materiality function, subject to grasping, the feeling function, perception function, conceptual function, and the cognizance function, subject to grasping. This is what is called the burden. And what is the bearer of this burden? To this it should be said, the person. This person named so-and-so from such and such a family is what is called the bearer of the burden. Make a note here. Then, what is the taking up of this burden? It is the craving that leads to further being, accompanied by passion and delight. Seeking pleasure here and there, it is namely craving for sensual pleasures, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. This is what is called the taking up of the burden. And what is the putting down of the burden? It is the complete dissolution and cessation of precisely that craving, the relinquishment and rejection of it, freedom from it, non-attachment to it. This is what is called putting down the burden. This is what the fortunate one said, and when he had finished, he spoke further as follows. Such burdens are the 5 existential functions subject to grasping, and the bearer of the burden is the person. Taking up the burden in this world is painful. Putting down the burden is happiness. Having put down the heavy burden, you should not take up another burden. Craving eradicated, together with its root, you are sated and quenched. So that's the sutta we have been studying in this practice period. Now I'll go through and make a few of my make some of my own commentary. The first thing that comes to my mind, really, I'll just speak about this quickly, is very often when we read the Nikayas, the fortunate one will say, listen to what I say. And occasionally I've noticed other speakers sometimes begin their talks with, please attend carefully to what I'm going to say. To me, I think I've only done that once. And, it takes a fair amount of confidence to begin a talk and believe that this is really important, what I'm going to say. So pay attention. But anyway, it's nice to contemplate if you're a speaker speaking on Dharma, that you are thoroughly confident about what you're going to say, to the degree that you can say, listen carefully to what I'm going to say. So I'm not saying it, but I'm just kind of bringing it up right now, as it's an inspiration for me. Okay, then what then is the burden? To this, it should be said, the five existential functions subject to grasping. Which five? Materiality, feeling, perception, conceptual fabrication, and cognition's functions subject to grasping. This is what is called the burden. I'd like to go through these in some amount of detail. We're all probably fairly familiar with five existential functions of grasping. Of course, they're called the five, technically they're called the five skandhas in Buddhism. And I'm going to read some footnotes that the translator has made about this. And these footnotes aren't actually from the burden itself. It's from another chapter. In fact, it's the next chapter, chapter 9. We're studying chapter 8. But he goes into some detail about giving some comments on these skandhas. So his comment is, the five components of grasping is the Buddha's shorthand for what we commonly refer to as person, self, identity, soul. Buddha says he looked everywhere in vain for the kind of stable, integral entity that is implied by such terms. You too can look, but where will you look? In your nose, ears, chest, stomach? Breath yourself can be found in your memories, thoughts. The more we look, the more absurd it appears the commonly held notion of my being, having a being, a self. For the Buddha, this persistent self that I have a being, a person, is the result of erroneously imputing an object where there is really only process. Now, this is, I think, he italicizes this word process. So I think that's very important for us to deeply integrate into our bodies and mind. All that's really going on is a continuous process of these five skandhas moving from one place to another. Constant movement in a process. Well, that's a really important concept, I think, as a roadmap to where we want to go in this practice, to keep in mind. This process, moreover, is perceptual in nature, having to do as it does with human existence. Okay. Although this process is a seamless flow devoid of stops, it can, on analysis, be said to have innumerable aspects. The Buddha all these skandhas uh, clusters, clumps, or aggregates, parts. Found it beneficial to identify 5 of them as possessing particular importance. I've contemplated that about a bit. Why does he pick these 5? Well, they're, to compartmentalize our self. Why form? Why materiality? Why perceptions? Why feeling? Why cognizance? And the other one, formations or conceptual fabrication. Well, they're easy for us to grasp, and also they're very important to us uh, existentially. If our body gets hurt or sick, we know, oh, we know about the body. We can feel the bodies. Same with feelings, perceptions, conceptual fabrications, and cognitions. Well, and he has other ways of gathering groups together to identify the self. This is one way. So keep that in mind. So I'm just going to go through, I'm not going to go through everyone in detail, but just a little bit. The materiality is the givenness of matter. And in Buddha's time, and Greeks and early Greek philosophy and other places, there were 4 elements, like 3,000 years ago or two. And they were earth, which represents solidity, water, showing that coherence. Fire is energy, and wind is distension, wind or air. Note that the Buddha is not concerned with the origin of these skandhas or their end. The world just as it is when you open your eyes is just there. You must deal with it just as it is, regardless of how it came to be or how it will cease. And I got a little derailed when I was preparing for this talk because I got a little interested in our current periodic chart of elements, which currently has 118 elements. Then I went back a little bit. When I studied chemistry in high school, there were only 100. And 100 years before then, there were 60 elements. So you can see we're growing our ability to divide the world up even more fractionally. So that's all I'll say about that. I almost started reading this 10-page long article on the periodic table because I have a little interest in science, but I thought that's probably not the best preparation to make for this topic, even though it's very interesting. Feeling is simply when a sense faculty comes into contact with a sense object, an emotional response is conditioned by that sensation. For example, when the nose meets a scent, the scent may be experienced in various registers of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neutrality. That's feeling in Buddhism. Of course, it's not what we understand these days to be feeling in our culture. But feeling in Buddhism is very primal, just Is what I'm experiencing pleasant or unpleasant, or is it neutral? And this experience triggers memories and emotions. It is important to note here that the sensation concerns the quality of visceral frictions and the feelings conditioned by that friction. It is not a matter of discriminating judgment or opinion. That comes later. First, it's just pleasant, unpleasant. Quite often I've given a talk or said, oh, yeah, like we human beings are prone to think that we as humans are the most sophisticated species on this earth. I think that's quite a common idea. Yeah, I won't go into it. I'm sure we've all thought that from time to time. But lately, I've had a lot of mice in my residence at Hokyoji and millipedes, and I can't find a way to keep them out. So I'm kind of thinking maybe they're smarter than I am. So, and in a lot of ways, animals are very, very smart. How do they survive a winter at Hokyoji without having any external heat? So I don't always think that we're the most sophisticated species in the existence. However, it's quite a common belief. Oh, so my point in bringing that up is sometimes for me, we're very primitive. We act in very, very primitive ways, even though we have all this sophisticated stuff going on in our world. And it comes back to this feeling when I started reading about this feeling, learning about it in Buddhism. It seems like to me we're just walking around in our world and we're going pleasant, unpleasant. Okay, that's pleasant. Oh, let's go that way. Oh, this is unpleasant. Let's turn it away. It's just very, very basic functioning. And then we add a lot of other stuff onto it. But at the primal level, it's just pleasant, unpleasant, neither. And that's what kind of bases you know, what our decisions, what we do. Perception is the processing of the object of sense as such and such. The sensation on the ear is a dog's bark, on the skin, a raindrop, on the tongue, a chocolate cookie. So it's just perceiving something that we have, what it is. And we'll talk about that a little later, in just a few moments, actually. So conceptual fabrication, this term is often translated as volition, since it's understood as an exercise of the will to fashion the perceived object in a particular way. But really, the Sanskrit verbal formation from the Pali is derived simply denotes putting together, forming, embellishing. And this is just a theoretical thing. We're going to go through a practical exercise in a moment. Lastly, I have something else. Okay. Namely, we construct the object by coloring our perceptions with qualities, judgments, and narratives, deriving largely from our side and not the side of the object itself, because we react to the world as it is fashioned by us rather than to some world in itself. And he says this conceptual fabrication, sankara, is the, I don't know if that's Pali or Sanskrit, but anyway, it's an acutely important Buddhist technical term. Cognition, so maybe I'll just let go. I'll make one statement. You can take it for what it's worth. Cognitions can be understood as being simultaneously the mirror and the appearance reflected in the mirror. I'll just leave it at that and let you contemplate that. The English term cognizance nicely captures this double meaning since it connotes both awareness itself and thinking about that which is given in that awareness. So he asked us to go through this in a kind of an exercise, and I think this is a way to get a little more firm grasp on these skandhas. So this is the exercise. Number one, note, first of all, the very presence of your ear in the physical world. What you are noticing is, of course, the givenness of materiality. So it's a material thing. The ear is. Sound is a material thing. It's part of the existence. Okay, number two, simply and directly notice the next sound that arises. Right now I'm hearing a little. Are you hearing that? Okay, but I'm not going to pay attention to that too much right now. Okay, simply notice directly what the next sound is that arises. Note the bare sensation engendered by the friction from the interaction of that sound in your ear. And I wonder what he means by friction. I guess it means wouldn't you say, kind of an engagement or something? What do you think about that, friction? Notice the friction. So I guess it's, there's something that needs attending to, or so maybe that's what friction means, or I want to know more about that, or whatever. Does this contact produce a sensation that is present, unpleasant, or neutral? How does this sensation condition how you feel mentally, physically, and emotionally? Okay. Third, notice that seemingly simultaneously with contact comes a particular perception concerning the nature of the sound object. Is it a passing car? Is it the chirping of a bird? Is it your daughter's voice? Is it someone coughing? So forth. So quite often we jump from right to that point. For instance, very often people, I mean, it's very common, especially in the springtime when we have the windows open at Hokyoji, that I've heard this comment very, very often that people like really appreciate the bird sounds, at Hokyoji, especially in the spring, in the morning when they're sitting zazen. But there's a long process we go through before we identify it as a bird song. It's just not, but this process is so subtle and quick that we jump to, it's a bird song or bird singing. But there's a lot going on before that, although it's operates very quickly before we can, identify it with a bird song. Fourth, carefully observe what you did with that perception. Did you start to weave some sort of story connected with the sound? Well, this is going to come to the mental fabrication part. Did you color it with names, views, opinions, values, judgments? In short, did you engage to any degree in manipulation and contrivance of the sound? Can you, in this matter, discern to what extent you played a role in co-creating that sound? Number 5, notice the reflective, mirror-like quality of simply being aware of the sound. It says glass, perhaps, is a more suitable metaphor than mirror, since glass is both transparent and reflective. Notice that within this spacious awareness, sorry, I got to get a ruler. I can't, and lines are going together. Okay, good. Notice that within this spacious awareness, a particular sound, particular object of sound awareness stands fully formed. Can you just be aware of this entire unfolding? This just, you may notice, requires simply leaving it alone. Then in another sutta, the Buddha's characterization of this entire process, he says in a verse, foam is like a lump of foam, feeling is like a water bubble, perception is like a mirage, conceptual fabrication is like a plantain tree, and cognitions like an illusion. However, one may ponder the self and carefully investigate it, it appears hollow and void, and when one views it carefully. I don't know much about plantain trees, but there's a footnote that says it's consists of endless layers, just without a core. But just it says kind of like an onion. I mean, you do get down to the middle of the onion is a little different, but really there's nothing solid there at the bottom. So that's just a little brief survey again of the 5 skandhas. We could study them for a long, long time, and it's 9:58. You got to be kidding me. Anyway, well, I think I'm going to go over my allotted time. When I was preparing this talk, I was going to assure you it will be no longer than, I will go no longer than 10 o'clock because my energy level, but my energy level seems to be doing okay. So I'm going to go on. Okay, next on the sutta. And what is the bearer of this burden? Oh, and he says, and what is the bearer of this burden? To this it should be said, the person, this person named so-and-so from such and such a family. This is what is called the bearer of the burden. And you'll notice it's not, he doesn't say, and who is the bearer of the burden? He just, and what is the bearer of the burden? And then the author brings up, and quite importantly, so that the Buddha is not denying that we have a person here called such and such from such and such a family, such and such a clan, as the literal language is put. And it's kind of a stark counterpoint to his very serious formulation that there is no actual person here. But then he goes back and says, well, it's this person. So that is to say that we should never overly emphasize that there is no person here. That's one side of the thing. On the other side, this is kind of like Zen. Whenever you read Zen stories, it's usually if the the student is coming to the teacher, he or she will come with a certain idea, and the Zen teacher usually brings it up from the other side. That's my understanding of some of these koans. And so this is very important to me, that while we emphasize there's no permanent, eternal person here, there is a person that's living in this world that has to be responsible for the actions it does, the speech it says, and the thoughts that it thinks. And they're all very connected. If we think obsessively about some unwholesome thoughts we're having, and be they angry thoughts or whatever, sooner or later, if we think about it obsessively, it's going to come out in our speech. A good example is we're angry at a person, and we just obsess over that. Well, if we continually obsess in our thinking, when we encounter that person, we're going to say something that's not completely appropriate. It's just going to happen. And if we start saying things over and over and over, we might do something. We might actually act in such a way that's not appropriate or conducive to harmony. We have to start at the beginning. Just watch what we're thinking and try to notice it, and especially try to relinquish unwholesome thoughts. Okay, so I'll just read briefly what he says about this person. His commentary is, this term translates as Pugala. This may seem a strange choice of words on the Buddha's part after his having strenuously refuted the notion of a self. My own view is that the Buddha is using the term person harmlessly. He is merely conforming to the conventional speech. But in using just this term, I think the Buddha is giving a subtle but crucial teaching. Don't think that the obvious lack of an inherent self, person, soul, life force, or whatever you want to call it, absolves you from the responsibilities of being a person. And don't pretend to not know what person means. We all know what it means, and we know perfectly well what it refers to. It refers to so-and-so from such and such a family. You know who that person is. I mean, another example is, okay, there's no person here, so I can do what I want. Do whatever I want. So I'm going to go out and take a candy bar from the shop. And what difference does it make? Well, the law enforcement officials may really emphasize, well, you do have a person, and you are responsible for the actions that you do as a person. And of course, taking a candy bar is one thing, and we can imagine worse things. Okay, now moving on. And what is the taking up the burden? It is this craving that leads to further being, accompanied by passion and delight, seeking pleasure here and there. It is namely craving for sensual pleasures, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. This is called the taking up of the burden. So this craving what is the origin of the unease we experience in our lives? The Buddha's answer is the fact that you demand too much, that we demand too much from the world. We ask, entreat, implore, intensely desire that the world's objects yield abiding pleasure, satisfaction, and security. But how can they? Their fundamental nature is impermanent, non-substantial, and unreliable. Asking too much is an old-fashioned meaning of the verb to crave. And he gives the Anglo-Saxon original name, something like kravion, something like that. The Pali term behind this translation is tanya, which means thirst. Well, what is the origin of human unease? Human unease, it is the perpetual demands that we make on the world and the parched state of being that arises from an apparently unquenched thirst for sensual pleasure. Well, I think we can pretty much all relate to that without further explanation. And the last part is, and what is the putting down of the burden? It is the complete dissolution and cessation of precisely that craving, the relinquishment, freedom from it, non-attachment to it. This is called putting down the burden. Okay, so that's it. And so I'm gonna go into another phase here and connect it to a Zen story. Either last week or the week before in our Sunday Dharma talk, I remember Frank Moss was present with us, and we were getting into some discussion about something or another. I'm not sure what it was, but he said, he brought up the story of jumping off a 100-foot pole. And this is all, in my opinion, this is all this sutta is about. It's in, I mean, if we put it in a practical manner, I mean, it's kind of a map. The 5 skandhas are a map by which we can move along this path. But it's a theoretical thing. It's in our minds. You know, a map doesn't get us to where we want to go. We got to do something. We follow the map, but we actually have to act to get to the place, to move where we want to go. And finally, though, to me, this sutta is not about doing the theoretical understanding. It's actually right in our zazen. How do we put down the burden? Just put it down means jumping off the 100-foot pole for me. And that's not an easy thing to do. In fact, as I was thinking about it a little more, I began to remember, maybe those of you who were present with Katagiri Roshi, I don't know if you remember or not, but he was a little bit fascinated, I remember, with the cliff divers of Acapulco. Does anyone remember that? Who was with him? You don't remember that, Akio? Okay. Well, at least on several occasions, I don't know if Rushin, you remember, Kim, but he would sometimes talk about these cliff divers, and he had a real fascination with it. You kind of go into it in a little bit of detail. And I did a little research on that, and they jump from about 100 feet to, but sometimes more, 136 feet. And then the longest jump is almost 200 feet. But as you can imagine, there are quite a few risks associated with jumping into water. Even though you're jumping into water, even at 100 feet, you're traveling like 60, 70 miles per hour when you hit the water. If you can imagine it, all within 3 seconds, you accelerate to that speed. Terminal velocity is 100. I can't remember if it's 120 or more, but anyway, for a human being. So anyway, I was very fascinated by remembering that. So jumping off the 100-foot pole is just to let go of all these craving, these skandhas subject to craving. And probably we of course in Zen we have this activity of zazen, which you know has over many years has presented itself as a very useful activity for understanding this. Just sitting still and recognizing what's going on in our minds with regard to these skandhas subject to grasping. So I have one more thing, and then we can, if we have questions, we can talk about. Now, related to this is one of my very favorite Zen stories, which I quote very often from Huang Po. He says, ordinary people look to their surroundings for security. Most of you have heard me say this before. Followers of the way, which are us, look to, he says, capital mind. So in that, the way he's using that is like awakening, big mind. We look to enlightenment for our salvation, right? You can sense that, right? Ordinarily, okay, we're younger, okay, we want to get a car, we want to get a house. This is going to make us secure. Good health insurance. Now that I do think is something you have to have. Even in Buddha's day, you had to have a kind of health insurance, although they didn't have health insurance. But he said medicinal requirements was one of the 4 requisites of it was food, shelter, clothing, and medicinal requisites. That you needed those 4 things to take up the study of Buddha's Eightfold Path. So that's important to remember. Okay, going on, he says, followers of the way look to capital mind, enlightenment, awakening. This is what's going to finally get rid of our problems and make us feel good forever. Then he says, the true way is to forget them both. Forget about enlightenment, forget about our physical. That's only going to take us a certain way, a certain point. But then the looking, we have to forget. We just have to forget about this pursuit of enlightenment or awakening. Just have to totally forget about it. He says the former is easy enough. That is to not look to our physical surroundings for security. It's easy enough to forget about that. Then he says the latter, that is looking for awakening, enlightenment, is very difficult to do. To me, that's very encouraging. A great Zen master remembered even these days, after 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, is saying it's very difficult to forget about wanting enlightenment or awakening. Because he says, we have to forget about capital mind. And he says, people are afraid to forget their minds, lest they fall into the void with nothing to stay their fall. And for me, that's similar to jumping off the 100-foot pole. Even if you're a cliff diver, then you got to forget about your mind if you're doing that, wouldn't you? I mean, wouldn't you say, oh God, that's a long ways down? Something like that. Am I going to get hurt? Or you just have to practice it so much that you can just do it. Still, they get hurt. And the only way they can do that, I read, after a certain height, is they have to have all this safety stuff around you. Scuba divers, boats, ambulance boat, they're all right there around, when if they fracture their back or whatever. So with nothing, and then Huangbo goes on a little bit about the beauty of this void, but that I don't have committed to memory, and I don't have the book with me. But it's not anything to be afraid of. It's just the true nature of existence that we're living in, something like that. But he's quite poetic about it. So so I'm saying I want to bring this down to a practical level. We are entering session here in the next week. So this sutta is about putting that burden down and also jumping off the 100-foot pole in both our Zazen practice and also in our non-Zazen practice. So that's all I have to say today. And I went till 10:17. And I know we probably want to close up by 10:30 exactly, because some of us have a meeting at 4 and some of us have to travel a few hours to get home for that meeting. And so I'll open it up to any comments or questions, and we will end by 10:30. I'll put that in your court, Aikyo. And of course, if there are, okay, there is one. Jim.
So you talked about earlier in the talk about you'll hear a sound and then you'll have the impression, I like the sound. Just like the sound, or is the sound neutral? And then we'll have, I don't remember if you called it mental formations, but we'll start having thoughts about the sound and opinions or whatever. But it made me think of sometimes those thoughts change our feeling about the sound. And the story that came to my mind was sesshin at Hokyoji, and I was Doan and Jikido and training someone else for those times. And we're sitting next to each other, and there starts to become little mouse noises from behind the wall directly in front of us. Scritchy, scritchy, scritchy. So, that first thing, negative reaction to the sound. And then some mental formations, just the thought of mice being right behind the wall, also kind of negative. But during one of our training times or whatever, where there's some visiting, she told me she had concocted this image in her head. She was picturing a little mouse sitting in a little sofa chair with his legs crossed, reading a little newspaper, with a couple little mice kind of scrimping and running around at his feet. And once she portrayed that image, then when we would hear the sound, because it'd be silent for like an hour or two, and then suddenly it would start up again, scritchy, scritchy, scritchy. And then the reaction was one of humor and trying not to snicker in the zendo. And so it was then that noise, the reaction was positive, just because of our little mental stuff we had put into it. So, there was the initial reaction, but then we told a story that made a different initial reaction when we heard the sound. Anyways, so I just wanted to share that if you had any.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember I have a disease called moosephobia. It's an actual disease. It's an abnormal fear of mice. So I just jump out of my skin if a mouse is, let alone crawling in my bed, or a dead one on my pillow, which I've experienced. But anyway, I just don't, I have an abnormal fear. So if one starts crawling around me and I sit on well, I used to sit on a ton, so that was a little bit, I felt, was it right on the floor, same level as the mom. But anyway, one of the things that kind of changed my image, you all know we offer a cup of water to Katagiri Roshi in the morning, and we keep it like on the shelf behind the altar. Uh, so the Jisha can offer it to the doshi. But anyway, a mouse was coming walking along that board where, and he kind of dunked his head into Katagiri Roshi's glass of water and started taking a long drink and come up and take a breath, go back. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I don't have to hate these creatures, you know. So anyway, that was interesting to notice. Okay, yeah, I mean, yeah. So I was using the image of the sound of a bird chirping, which okay, usually maybe evokes a pleasant feeling. But in the fall, if we have the windows open, you might hear a gunshot. And what does that do? Well, that's going to maybe shift a different feeling tone, like unpleasant, you know. So just it can be a lot of different things. Okay. Anything else? We got 8 minutes left. And of course, I was going to say, well, if there are no comments, that's perfectly fine as well. Alex is making a dash for the microphone. Pleasant or unpleasant?
You got it.
Okay.
So Sandy's parents harassed us.
Hang on a minute. Do you have the mic to your mouth?
You don't have the mic, so could you stand closer to the?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's just a little echoey.
So Sandy's parents harassed us for many years to go on a cruise with them through the Caribbean, and finally we relented because everyone's getting older and it may not happen again. So one of the stops was Grenada, and in Grenada there are cliff divers. It's not 100 feet, but it's like maybe 30 feet, 20 feet, and you take a little bus tour, and it goes to little spice shops, and then eventually this is the payoff, as you get to see these teenagers doing cliff diving, and it's like younger ones are diving like 15, 20 feet, and the older teenagers are diving like 30 feet, and they're basically hustlers. They come up to you and say, give me $10 and I'll jump off the 30-foot thing. And I told them, I'll give you $10 if you quit jumping. And they wanted nothing to do with me, and it seemed to me to be very dangerous because they're climbing up rocks, and it's slippery rocks.
Yeah.
You can get up there. So, but they wanted nothing to do with me trying to stop the hustle. This is the way they make their living. You don't see didn't see anybody like 20 years old doing this. Right? So there's something going on there. And the cliff diving in Acapulco is really tricky because you have to time the waves to get the maximum depth of water. So it's a pretty tricky business.
Yeah. Well, I watched a little video, and wow, maybe there's other ways they get up, but the video showed this guy climbing up the cliff to get, and it looked treacherous, just the climbing up to the point. I mean, it was all rocky, and they're doing it barefoot, and it's like, wow, just the climb up there yeah, you're right about that. Okay, anyone else? Okay, going going.
Dokai, I want to
Yeah.
ask,
Oh.
since we have session coming up. First of all, it's great to see you moving and grooving, feeling good. But since we have session coming up,
Yeah.
a question as old as time:
Yeah.
how do we relinquish thought?
Relinquish thought. My my guidance would be sit in zazen. Don't worry about your thinking too much. Just notice that you're thinking. And when you notice you're thinking, just relinquish it. And then, a millisecond later, another thought will come up. So you just notice that you're thinking. That's the main point. Just notice you're thinking. If you don't notice you're thinking, you got no alternative. It's kind of like I often use the simile that it's like an addiction. I really do believe we are addicted to thinking. Human beings. It's just an addiction. And of course, in the 12, I don't know a whole lot about the 12-step process, but I think the first step is you have to know you're addicted. You have to know that before you can do anything, or you have to notice that. So I think it's like that. First, we have to notice that we're thinking obsessively. Then we have an opportunity to do something different than to just keep doing that. So, and yeah, especially in the first day or two of session, but now, most of you who will be attending the session have been there for a couple of weeks. So, you have a little calmer base to enter into session, which is really nice, really nice. Even though the first day can be very grueling, as we all know, of session, first couple of days. And it's mainly because just the thinking is just coming up over and over and over again without us being able to notice it or negotiate with it. I got close up here in 2 minutes. So then, it's a practice. We just do the practice, noticing the thoughts arising, making this. I also use the notion that is if we're starting a thinking process, it'll become into a long fabricated story if we don't relinquish it. On and on and on and on and on and on. And we might sit a whole period, not just absorbed in some fabricated story. That's happened to me. So, and then, but at other times, we can notice very rapidly when thoughts are arising. Almost we can see the arising and vanishing of them almost together if we're becoming quite still in our zazen. So it's just practice, Alex. First recognizing that you're thinking, and then making the effort to let it go. And that's not always easy because we really like our stories. Always the subject of our stories is me, and that's nice. And I'm always making really nice stories of myself, or sometimes bad stories, but that's entertaining too. It keeps me engaged instead of just ordinary nothing zazen, which gets kind of boring sometimes. Or just like we're afraid when things get too quiet. And it's 10:30 now. Ekyo, you need to cut me off.
All right, you're done, Dokai.
May your day go well.
That's it. Thank you for your talk. So next Sunday, we have Jushin. Stephen Butcher is giving the talk. He's our Shuso for this practice period, and a board member and a beloved member of the community. So we're looking forward to that. And After that, we'll be entering, after the practice period's over, we'll be entering into our fallow time. Mud season will be coming, so not a lot happens here during that time publicly. Yeah, and the next thing we would have that's a public thing would be a work period, and I think that's in April. So let's end with the closing vows. Oh, and you can donate. There's a, if you want to, there's a, you can find a link on the website to, if you appreciate these talks. We'd like that, and remember to like us on Facebook as well, social media. Okay, let's do the final vows. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
And enjoy your football game, those of you who will be watching it.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.